All right, good morning, everybody. I hope you're all doing well. It's certainly cold in many parts of the US, so I hope you are all staying warm and that you have power to keep warm. Um, let's get going today. All righty, so I'm just going to bring up, just curious how everybody's doing today on a scale of 1 to 9 rubber ducks. How are you feeling today? Give me a shout out in the chat. Pick a number that describes how you're feeling. All right, well, we're all over the place. We've got 5s and 9s, 2s. Excellent. A little deflated, but still going. Go, Abby, go. Excellent. All right, cool. All right, I think I might be kind of somewhere in the 6 range myself, 3 maybe. Anyway, I know we're kind of coming up on the middle of the semester, so the nice thing is you've already had one of our exams, so hopefully as you do hit the midterm, you'll be able to focus some of your extra needed energy in some of the other midterms that are sure to come up over the next couple of weeks. So just make sure you're kind to yourself. You give yourself extra time to study, but also extra time to sleep and do whatever it is that helps you de-stress during midterm time, because it can be kind of stressful. Okay, so let's get going today. We're going to do a couple of things. I'm going to cover some content, and then we're going to do some breakout discussions at the end. So in this lecture, what I want to do is build on some of the asynchronous work that you've already done to look at some of the key terms and concepts. Things like sectors in the economy, the idea of putting some of the ideas around globalization into a particular regional context regarding economic growth over the last 30 to 40 years. So this is kind of a big picture of trends in the global north. And much of what I'm going to talk about today is really a focus on the US economy. What is happening in the US economy is pretty much the same kinds of trends that we see in many countries in the global north. So Canada, Britain, Germany, France, and even Japan go through these same processes and experience these same trends. And what we see happening in the global north is distinct in many ways from what we're going to look at in terms of trends in the global south. And that's partly because the global economy really emerges over this last 40 years. And that plays out differently in different regions around the world. So I'm going to go way, way, way back in history, back like when your parents were probably like in kindergarten, maybe even not even alive yet. But what I want to do is kind of set up the last 50 years in the US economy. So after the end of the Second World War, between 1950 and 1970, the US economy was growing very rapidly. In fact, it was the fastest growing economy in the world for those 20, 25 years or so. It enjoyed what is known as a trade surplus, meaning that it was exporting more goods than it was importing. And this partly occurred because the US economy was in a much stronger position coming out of the end of the Second World War. Most of the European economies needed to rebuild themselves, literally, rebuild factories, rebuild their manufacturing and industries, whereas the US, in the mainland anyway, really didn't have any destruction that was associated with the war. So this is really an important difference to have a trade surplus versus a trade deficit, because basically a trade surplus means that you're generating more money in your economy than you are sending outwards into other countries by buying goods that are manufactured elsewhere. However, in the last 40 years, really particularly since 1971, but very noticeable by the 1980s, the US economy begins to experience some shifts. And one of the impacts is that it begins to import more than it is exporting. Okay, and this leads to an ongoing trade deficit. And the US economy still maintains its place as one of the largest in the world. It is the largest economy. And it has continued to grow, but many economists and other kinds of trade experts still see challenges. And some of these challenges include things like there has been declining wages for most working people. If you look at, for example, minimum wage has really failed to keep up with changes in inflation and currency valuations. At the same time, we're seeing a lot of corporations that are experiencing incredibly high profits. And so the difference between, say, the average CEO salary versus the average worker within that company has actually gotten higher or bigger over the last 30 years. So you might recall that term, the global shift. We talked a bit about it when we were looking at and defining globalization. Now I want to put the concept of the global shift within a regional context, which is looking at the United States. So for the United States, the global shift has meant a couple of things. It has primarily meant a shift away from the secondary sector or the industrial economy to the service sector. Now, those should be familiar terms that you covered last week in the asynchronous work that you did, those different sectors of the economy, right? And that's why those are important to understand, because they help us understand some of the big shifts that the United States has been experiencing. This shift away from the secondary sector to the service sector has largely been described as deindustrialization. And we can see that in how clothing, the trends in made in America clothing, right? So in the 1960s, almost everything that Americans would have bought to wear was made in the United States. But this begins to shrink. And you can see by 1975, it was down to 80%. By 1995, it was 50%. And today, only about 2% of the clothing that we would buy in the United States is actually made in the United States. So this shift from a almost 100% made in America to hardly anything made in America really encapsulates or embodies that notion of shifting manufacturing. In this case, we're talking about the manufacturing of clothing, but we could be talking about the manufacturing of a lot of other things, from toaster ovens to shoes to many of the things that we buy as consumers on a daily basis. Okay, and so when we talk about deindustrialization, we're talking about something that's happening particularly pronounced in the global north, and it's a period of economic change in which jobs and production in the secondary sector decline significantly. Natalie, you had a question. Go ahead and ask it.
Yes, good morning, Professor. I was just wondering, I think I speak on behalf of all of my classmates when I say that this is incredibly surprising that only 2% of American worn clothing is made in the United States. I was wondering if you know when exactly was concern raised regarding this topic. Obviously, we see it's sort of a steep decline, but was there a certain year, a certain percentage where politicians and Americans were really raising concern on this topic?
Yes, I would say by the mid to late 1980s, early 1990s. But what happens is that there's not a whole lot that Americans can do about this shift, because we don't have the ability to tell a company that they can't leave the United States and go manufacture their shoes or their cars elsewhere. So it takes a while for this to begin to happen. It really picks up in the 1980s. And we'll kind of come back to this a little bit in a few minutes. I'll try and kind of put the deindustrialization context in a little bit more of a reveal it in terms of particularly around automobiles, right? And automobile manufacturing. Evan, you had a question. Go ahead and ask it.
This is more so a classification question. I know that we talked about how agriculture and the agricultural sector is mainly classified as the primary sector, but would industrial agriculture like that which goes on in the United States, creating products that are mainly exported like soy or a lot of corn that we produce isn't used in, it's not like farm to table, it's used in the production of meats and other, I guess, secondary agricultural goods. Would that still be considered primary sector?
Correct. So when you think of secondary sector, you're manufacturing something. Now, if we're exporting potato chips as opposed to potatoes, that's different, right? But if you're talking about just exporting food goods in their raw, whole form, that would definitely be, whether or not, you know, we produce them using tractors and heavy equipment. That's not really what we're talking about in terms of industrial manufacturing, right? I'm talking about the production of things, of goods. Right, yes, Henry. So primary would be an example of exporting corn. Secondary would be that processing of corn into ethanol, and however ethanol gets into the either local or international economy, that would be considered a secondary product. Okay, so what begins to happen in the United States is this huge shift, but it has a geography to it, right? Or otherwise, I probably wouldn't be talking about it. So on the one hand, we have the decline of manufacturing, which is deindustrialization. And one of the things that keeps the United States economy continuing to grow as opposed to falling into utter despair and collapse is the fact that at the same time, we're seeing the decline of manufacturing in the secondary sector. We're seeing the rise of the service sector. Everything from, the tertiary sector, which might be kind of, just basic things like retail, all the way to kind of those advanced producer services like legal and accounting. Okay, so these two twin processes are happening at the same time within the US economy, right? Now, a good geographer would realize that these are going to be affecting different places differently and impacting different people differently, right? Because chances are someone who's working in manufacturing may not have the skill set or the correct kind of certification to move seamlessly into accounting. Right? So we're talking about, things that are happening broadly within the economy are affecting some places more than others and are also affecting different people within those different places different, right? So geographers speak of, this shift in the US economy because it's a two-pronged thing, right? It's deindustrialization on the one hand, but the rise of the service sector on the other. And both of these have a geography to where they are happening most intensely. Now, we can say that manufacturing's on the decline everywhere in the United States. That's generally true. And there has been a rise in the service sector pretty much everywhere in the US. But when we talk about where is it significantly felt first, there's definitely a geography to it. And geographers, urban geographers in particular, have termed the concept the Rust Belt, which was once the old manufacturing belt. Most people don't like the term Rust Belt because it seems to mean something derogatory. If we're talking about it having a specific impact on places, it's not great to be thought as a Rust Belt state or a Rust Belt city. But we can talk about states like Ohio and Pennsylvania, New York, Maryland, Illinois, Indiana, as being part of that decline of manufacturing and the rise of the Sun Belt in places like California, Texas, and Florida. Right. So let's do a quick dive into deindustrialization, and then we'll look equally at the service sector. Okay. So although deindustrialization has impacted the secondary sector across the US, it's also true that it's concentrated in certain regions in the US where the secondary sector really represented a huge amount of jobs and was quite dominant in building up these urban economies. So this is a map of essentially the old manufacturing belt, sometimes referred to as the Rust Belt. And you can see the states in red are kind of the traditional manufacturing of industrial goods, from cars to refrigerators to bicycles. It includes cities like Syracuse and Rochester and Buffalo in the state of New York, to Pittsburgh and Erie, Pennsylvania, to Cleveland, Dayton, Cincinnati, in Ohio, up to Detroit in Michigan, and then cities like Fort Wayne, or even Decatur in Illinois. And then the states highlighted in kind of that yellow area, mustard yellow, are industrial manufacturing areas around both steel and coal mining. Both of those types of industrialization processes have seen a massive decline over time. So deindustrialization is not just an abstract shift in jobs. Okay, if someone loses their job, they may not be able to keep up with their mortgage payments or rent payments. And deindustrialization in Detroit, for example, has led to thousands of vacant homes as people fell behind in terms of being able to pay their mortgage payments or their rent. So many people not only lost their jobs, sadly, they begin to lose their housing through either foreclosure or failure to keep up with payments. So many of the cities that were just kind of shown on that map as being kind of really industrial cities where, 20, 30, 40% of the jobs in those cities revolve around an industrial economy, they were also obviously hit significantly more hard by this big shift, right? And perhaps no place has been hit harder than Detroit, where not only did we see hundreds of thousands, if not millions of jobs lost, we also saw the costs associated with vacant properties as people were essentially, evicted from their homes or their apartments, right? And so actually there's some mapping projects that have been looking at vacant and abandoned properties as a way to help the city of Detroit prioritize how to demolish vacant buildings, because vacant buildings are a problem. They can cause a city to spend a lot of money to try and police or service vacant properties. Oftentimes they become places where fires can break out or crime is happening. And so it actually is a huge drain on a city's economy to continue to try and deal with vacant properties. So in Detroit, there's been a real push over the last 20 years to demolish vacant properties because they still have to provide services like electricity or trash pickup or gas to these areas. And it can be very expensive to continue to service areas where there's a lot of vandalism or vacant properties. So you can see, for example, the number of properties in vacant in 2000 versus 2010. So this is a process that takes quite a long time, and the consequences play out over a period of time, right? And so one of the growth areas in Detroit's economy has actually been demolition work, because as the city made prioritizing demolishing vacant properties, then there's been a growth in that industry, because you just don't knock down a house, you have to knock it down safely so that you're not necessarily impeding the structural integrity of houses around it, but then you also have to haul off all of that debris. And so you can see the difference between 1966 at the bottom, that was what Detroit's inner ring suburbs look like, and by 2006 you can see that same plot of space has been significantly impacted by demolition. So deindustrialization began before you were born, but I want to make the point that it is still a process that's continuing. We've got a little reindustrialization happening as some manufacturing might find a niche back here in the United States. But for the most part, when we speak generally, deindustrialization is still a process that is occurring in global north countries. And it's still something that is occurring today. And in fact, you can probably Google, factory closures since 2015, and you'll find that there's still a lot of our major manufacturers, car manufacturers, for example, closing down manufacturing plants in many places. There's a very poignant film called The Last Truck, which follows the closing of, I believe it's a GM plant in Moraine Valley in Ohio. And that was a factory that employed something like 5,000 people, right? And so it was closed fairly recently, I want to say in the last 5 years. And so these have knock-on effects. So this slide is just showing you, In 1959, 28% of what was generating economic growth or GDP in the United States was manufacturing. By 2008, it had gone down to 11%, so half, less than half of what it had been. And it's estimated that since 2001, the United States has lost more than 42,000 factories. And it's probably equal amounts of factories lost between 1980 and 2000. And even in the last 20 years, there's been about a loss of 5.5 million manufacturing jobs. Some estimates are that between 1980 and 2000, there was about 7 to 9 million lost manufacturing jobs, right? So sometimes this has tremendous consequences for a city. And it's not just those jobs that are lost in the manufacturing plant, but I want you to think about what is known as the multiplier effect, right? Think of all the lunch trucks or the diners that supply lunches to those people that work in the manufacturing plants. Or think about the production, the smaller scale manufacturing that may be happening in, say, like a Kent, Ohio, that is manufacturing tires that they ship to the Ford Motor Company in Detroit to put on those tires, to put on those trucks, right? So when a company closes a manufacturing plant, it tends to multiply that impact outwards. So we're going to come back to deindustrialization at the end, but let's move on now to the growth of the service sector, which has also been quite pronounced and has an important geography to it, right? So one of the big trends in the United States economy, as with most of the global north, has been a tremendous growth in tertiary services, and specifically in the global north, advanced producer services, things like doctors, lawyers, accountants, CEOs, advertising. This growth in the service sector has largely been not only where the United States economy has been most pronounced and most successful, it's driven economic growth for the last 30 to 40 years. And so when we look at things like the different sectors within a country's economy, you'll probably find that global north economies have very small percentage of economic activity happening in the primary sector, far less in the secondary sector than they ever had before, and primarily a lot going on in the tertiary sector. In a very low-income country, say a Mali, we would find 40 or 50, maybe even 60% of Mali's economy is going to be based in the primary sector. And it's going to have some service sector, but it's not going to be nearly as robust as, say, what we find in the global north. Right? So the growth in the service sector, just like deindustrialization, has been geographically uneven, and it's impacted some regions more than others, offering growth and opportunity in some places over others. And so geographers talk about the rise of the Sun Belt as the place where the service sector has happened most intensely. So here's our map of the Sun Belt, right? You can see it's highlighted in red. Not surprisingly, it corresponds with warm and sunny places, right? And it stretches, say, from the Carolinas through Florida, where it picks up and moves westward through Texas and into California. And this is really where most of the job gains have been so pronounced in the tertiary sector, right? So this is in contrast to the previous map that really highlighted the Midwest and parts of the old, Northeast manufacturing corridor, right? So here's state economies, just to give you a comparison between 1963 and just a couple of years ago. So some of the states' economies are still very powerful. In New York and California were ranked high in 1963. They're still ranked high in 2017, right? But let's pay attention to some of our maybe more traditional manufacturing areas, like in Ohio, Michigan, and in Indiana. They kind of they fall quite a bit in their place, and some of them kind of fall out of even the top 10. So Indiana is no longer in the top 10, right? But what we do see, for example, is kind of Texas going from 7 to the number 2 state economy. We see Florida up here on the top. We see Georgia, right? So these are kind of our Sunbelt states that begin to see tremendous growth and so generate tremendous growth. So California is the leading state economy now. It has a GDP that is like, we would rank it, I think, 40th in the world of other countries. It would be ranked 40th, right? So we have some really powerful state economies within the United States economy. Ian, you had a question?
Yeah, I was just going to ask real quick, what potentially facilitates
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
state economies? Was it? Hello? Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was just asking what facilitated the rise of Texas as a state economy?
Great question. A lot of it was oil. So that was the one industrial manufacturing that has not declined. That's actually increased. But also a lot of the IT, if you think about actually, a lot of the IT was based in Dallas and in Houston. And the service sector largely rose, and also the military. There's a lot of military bases in states like Texas, Florida, and Georgia that really expanded after the 1960s and 1970s. So you have a lot of federal investment. Yes, it's very funny how Texas is very much in the cold right now. So some of it can be explained kind of with kind of the overall what drew the service sector to the Sun Belt. Okay, let's take a look really quickly at the fastest growing and shrinking cities. So shrinking cities are those cities that are losing population. And we can see some of them are, so this is 2015, so we're still waiting on the 2020 census. We don't have that information yet. Hopefully by the end of the next couple of months we will. But you can see that some of our shrinking cities are still in, traditional Rust Belt or manufacturing cities, and many of our fastest growing are down here in, in our Sun Belt, right? Not completely, but oftentimes. And some of these smaller ones, like these ones, are really kind of more around retirement areas or recreational areas. But if we were to look at the real big cities, we would still see tremendous growth in the Sun Belts versus the Rust Belt, right? And a lot of people relocated from manufacturing cities to Sun Belt cities. But again, not everybody was able to move easily, right? If you have a house and you all your money is tied up in your house and you lose your job, you might still be able to make housing payments. But if people are leaving the city because there's just no economic opportunity, who is going to buy your house, right? So a lot of people got stuck staying in cities that were experiencing deindustrialization. But it is true that the fastest growing areas in the Sun Belt attracted huge migration from other parts of the US. Right. So there's a video that that's linked in our Blackboard that kind of explains some of the factors that attracted people to the Sun Belt. It includes the fact that there's a lot of federal investment in military bases and also in the creation of the military industrial complex, that creation of military and universities that worked hand in hand to do a lot of research and development. So when we think of, say, a Lockheed Martin, or actually it had been Lockheed and Martin, and then they merged, but Honeywell and some of the defense contractor work was taking place in the Sun Belt. Lots of engineers, and one of the advantages of the Sun Belt was great temperatures, right? So if you're going to try and recruit highly skilled and educated engineers and accountants, maybe they want to live in places that are sunny and warm most of the year round. And so that kind of became how the Sun Belt began to really attract tremendous investment as well as people. So now we have a sense of what's been happening in the US in general, right? This kind of dual decline in manufacturing on the one hand and the rise of the service sector on the other. Let's take a look at what this means for the US within the global economic context, right? How is the United States positioning itself? How is it reacting to these changes within the US economy? How does that change how it's strategizing trade and economic policies within the global economy? Okay. So I thought I'd give you a snapshot of basically the last year or so. So our top 10 biggest economies in the world are the United States in terms of total generation of GDP. It's about $22 trillion, followed by China, followed by Japan, Germany, the UK, India, France, Italy, Brazil, and Canada. So one of the things you can just see in this top 10 list is that we have a lot of global north countries and two really interesting global south countries with China and India, right? But if we turn our attention to this part of the table, this is GDP growth, right? So this is how much the economy, the GDP of the US economy is growing between 2019 and 2020 over a one-year period. And you can see that even though the United States is the largest economy overall in terms of money, it is not the fastest growing economy. And that's really important to understand, because when we take a look at the fastest growing economies, China and India, our two countries in the global south, have been growing far quicker. And that is part of this global shift as well. And we'll talk more about that over the course of this unit, how changes in the global south, what kinds of changes the global south has experienced. Okay, but I do want to set up this idea that GDP growth is also part of how the United States feels it's doing in terms of being a robust and vital economy. So let's compare the US economy in 1970 with what it looks like today. So a couple of figures are worth noting. In 1970, our GDP growth rate was 4.3%. Today, it's about 2%. So it's down from 1970, right? Our trade imbalance, we had a trade deficit, was about $647 million in 1970. Today, it's $697 billion. So that's hugely going in the negative direction, right? I mean, that's just astonishingly, negative, right? When we look at minimum wage adjusted, we actually had higher minimum wage back in 1970 than we do now. When we look at CEO salaries as a percentage of their workers, 23 times in 1970, and more recently, about 303 times average worker's salary. And then our tax rates are actually down significantly from 1970 to today. So we've really seen over the last 30 to 40 years just a trend in reducing taxes significantly. Other things worth looking at, murder rate is down, so that's good, right? Yeah, it's a positive thing for a society to go from 8% to 4%. So that's good. But you can see that, there's some things that might be concerning to an economist. And certainly GDP growth rates are not what they had been before. And our trade deficit continues to grow instead of shrink, right? And those two things are kind of what drives the US to strategize and react as it has in the last 20 to 25 years. Okay. When we take a look at long-term trends, like going back more than 100 years, you can see that we're really looking at a trend of growth, right? I mean, this is a trend that is showing you growth over time. Now, we also want to be cognizant of the little dips here and there, maybe some recessions, right? And those are important because they sometimes for the short term can make can have a huge impact on not just overall economic growth, but people losing jobs from time to time. And so those are important little dips. But I think the big story of US growth is that it has been growing. But when we think about that previous slide that had, the deficit's been increasing instead of shrinking, and GDP growth rates aren't as robust as they have been, that begins to put an important spin on understanding some of the trends. Right. So when we look at GDP growth, this is GDP growth rates as a percentage, right? So we probably hit a peak probably in the late 1960s, where the US economy was growing maybe as much as 5% a year, okay? Since the 1970s, however, you can see that we haven't really been growing much more than above 3%, and then really since the 2000s, we've been struggling to be above 2%, period. Okay, so when people talk about the US economy not being as robust, what they're really referring to is the golden years here, right, where we were not only the leading economy, but we were the fastest growing economy. And then this notion that somehow there has been kind of a dip in growth. And that for some people is that measure of what, their response to looking at the difference between growth rates at 5% and growth rates here is to say, what's wrong? What's wrong with our economy, right? And for some, it's that question of deficits, trade deficits. We are importing now far more than we export, and that was not true back when we had our robust years of growth, okay? In particular, you've heard a lot of the rhetoric that has tended to put China and the United States in competition with each other. And it is true that China is a major trade partner with the United States. We tend to buy a lot of Chinese imports. We're importing a lot of Chinese goods. They are not buying as much from us. And so we run a huge trade deficit with China. Now, having said that, we run a trade deficit with just about every other country, and our second greatest trade deficit is with our neighbor to the north, Canada, right? But you might have heard in the political rhetoric that, this trade imbalance with China is, one of the reasons for our poor performance, our sluggish GDP growth, our trade imbalance. And certainly China, the story of China, which we'll talk about over the next week or two, is one of tremendous growth. For most of the last 15 to 20 years, their GDP growth has been above 7%, right? And the United States has been struggling to stay at 2, maybe hitting 2.5, right? So China's economy has been on fire. The United States, it's kind of more like, the little engine that just keeps plugging away, going up the hill quietly. China's like, Usain Bolt, he's speeding by, blowing everybody away, right? And it's this difference that helps set up kind of the tension between the US with regards to our economic exchange and particularly our trade deficit with China. But again, it's not just China, because we have a trade deficit with many countries. But just to kind of give the number 1 and number 2 economies kind of the difference, right? So for 2020, our nominal GDP was 21 trillion. China's was 14 trillion, making them the second largest economy in the world. That was not true 10 years ago, right? So China has done an enormous transformation in a short period of time, and we're going to talk about that. When we look at GDP per capita, however, the United States has among the highest per capita in the world at 63,000 versus China's 10,000, right? So there's still, even though China has the second largest economy, that is starting to affect per capita, and they've come a huge way, but their GDP per capita, or average income per person, is really far below what the United States is. but they do have a significantly higher GDP growth rate at 6.1% for this year, and ours is about 2.2. And our trade balance is a negative 692 billion, whereas China has a positive 422 billion, right? China is now the world's manufacturing, right? So when we talk about the global shift, a lot of manufacturing left the global north to go to the global south. Manufacturing went to places like Thailand and Malaysia and Brazil and India, and boy, it really went to China. A couple other really interesting statistics. Deaths from COVID, 485,000 in the United States, reportedly 4,800 in China. We know that's probably undercounting, but even if it's off by a little bit, that's a significant difference. And then vehicles per 1,000 people, kind of maybe a sign of affluence. 823 vehicles per 1,000 people in the United States, only about 118 vehicles per 1,000 people in China. So, you know, you have the top two economies, you have some differences going on. So this has really affected our trade strategy, okay? And one of the ways that it has affected our trade strategy is that, you know, trade experts and economists have been wringing their hands about our trade deficit. Like, you don't want to run a trade deficit for a really long time because that does tend to impact your economy, right? So the solution to having a trade deficit is to figure out a way to make you stop importing so much and export more, right? You want other people to be buying goods. So since the 1980s, you know, the US has really struggled to figure out how to increase the sale of US goods abroad. One of the tough things is that, you know, our wages are fairly high, our labor protections are good, like we have health and leisure, health and retirement benefits, right? And that tends to make our goods far more expensive than, say, it can be manufactured in countries that don't maybe have environmental protection measures or health and safety regulations for their workers, or where their wages are very low. And at the same time, other countries may be protecting their domestic industries with government subsidies that might provide them with lower interest rate loans to get going, or even things like quotas and tariffs that are applied to goods that come in from the outside, right? So one of the ways that the US trade strategy has really focused is on a ideology called neoliberalism. And I want you to make sure you read the John Short textbook where he talks about neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is really about this notion of removing protectionist trade barriers. They could be tariffs, which is like a tax. They could be a quota, like only so many cars can come in from Ford Motor Factory into China this year, right? So these are all things that would prevent the free market from operating freely. And neoliberalism is also known as kind of trade liberalization, right? We want a free and fair trading platform. Nobody should be protecting their industries. Nobody's government should be giving subsidies. Now, let's be honest, the US has a lot of subsidies to a lot of different industries. We have agricultural subsidies, we do have industrial subsidies, right? But this is in theory. Neoliberalism is about a free market where we don't have restricted policies in place. For the most part, the US has far fewer restrictions than many countries in the global south. And that has been one of the reasons for our trade deficit. It has been hard for US goods to get sold abroad because either they might be too expensive compared to the domestically produced good that's the same, right? Or there might be extra taxes on top of those, or just simply a threshold of quotas. Abigail, you had a question. Go ahead and ask it.
Yeah, so since you mentioned earlier that the US is mostly a service sector economy, wouldn't that currently create a trade deficit with other countries who are mostly doing manufacturing?
Yeah, so we still have industrial manufacturing going on. It's not like we don't do any of it, right? I mean, we still manufacture goods. In some ways, we tend to manufacture more luxury goods that are higher end goods, and that's one of the reasons why they might be too expensive for some consumers in the global South, right? So there still is some manufacturing going on, and we still produce things. But you're right. The opportunity to right this trade deficit is a little bit more difficult when most of what we do is in the service sector, and most of what we're trying to do is open up other economies to our goods. Some service sector things can be exported, like legal services or accounting or advertising, right? And so that has been some of the strategy. But in the early days of the 1980s and 1990s, when deindustrialization was happening, the US reaction was, oh my gosh, we're losing our manufacturing because these other countries have things in place that are not fairly allowing our goods to be competitive, okay? Even as deindustrialization has continued, there is still this idea that, you know, now neoliberalism is bigger than just restrictive barrier policies, but in this context that I'm talking about right now, it's really about trying to make a more level trading field. Okay, so this is complex stuff, and we're not going to be able to get into the weeds. If you really want to learn more about this, I super encourage you to think about taking our economic geography class, where you can spend most of the semester looking at some of these trends and processes. We're going to do it so briefly, right? One of the ways that we can see neoliberalism applied is in how the United States has created free trade agreements. So in 1988, the US and Canada created the Free Trade Agreement, which then allowed the free movement of goods and people across the border in a way to try and ease up restrictions to getting imports and exports flowing better. And then that was superseded in 1993 with the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And I know it got renamed by the Trump administration, but I can't remember what it was renamed, something that actually is even more of a mouthful than NAFTA. But what NAFTA does is it involves the US, Canada, and Mexico. And this is a free trade agreement that allows food and energy, particularly oil flowing from Canada, and raw materials to be traded without any restrictions or tariffs at the border or quotas at the border. And so this is kind of what has become a real big process that we see underway in many economies regionally, is this notion of regional economic integration. So next week, when we start to look at trends in the global South, we'll see that there's free trade agreements in many other regions. And you might remember that Sub-Saharan Africa has several economic trading agreements with different countries, just for the same process of freeing up trade. That's right, the USMCA. I still think NAFTA is actually an easier thing to say. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Natalie, though. And so there's a very short video that you can look at the objectives and ideas behind NAFTA and why it reflects neoliberal principles. Okay. So that is kind of the big picture of the global North. So, you know, the same things, the same kinds of trends that we see in the United States, we see playing out in Canada, in Germany, in France, in the UK. They've all seen deindustrialization. They've all tried to react by, you know, creating, especially through the World Trade Organization, the principles of free trade, of removing restrictions and other types of barriers. And they see that as how they need to shift the playing field between the global North and some of the high-performing economies in the global South, such as China and India and Brazil and Mexico. So these are kind of things that we'll come back to a little bit when we're looking at the global south, because things are changing in the global south, and their economies are doing slightly different things than the global north. So now what I want you all to do is you're going to go to your breakout sessions, and I'm going to show you a very short video on Youngstown, and you're going to answer some questions together. So let's see. I'm going to try this time to show the video for you guys. It's about 9 minutes. And so go ahead and open up that Google Doc for our breakout sessions if you haven't already. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to try and share with you the video. And I'm going to put myself on mute because I think last time you could hear it reverbing through my own microphone. So I think I know the solution here. But if you can't hear anything, ping me in the chat. Okay. All right. Okay, hold on a sec. I am going to.
This house on the south side of Youngstown has been vacant for 8 years. The city condemned it after a fire inside. Now it's being torn down. Robert Morris lives next door. He says he's glad to see these abandoned homes in his neighborhood finally get demolished.
This neighborhood right here, this used to be high class over here. I mean, this whole South Avenue corridor was it was nice. It was really nice.
These demolitions are part of a citywide plan to eliminate blight and rebuild. Since the 1950s, Youngstown's population has declined by 60%, from about 168,000 to 65,000, and is still shrinking. Thousands of empty homes have been left behind, crippling the housing market and eroding the social fabric of this once mighty industrial base. When the steel mills closed in the 1970s, Youngstown lost 40,000 good-paying jobs. Today, almost 40% of residents live below the federal poverty line, earning less than $24,300 a year for a family of 4.
What's a city to do as a city? Pick itself up, dust itself off, and start all over again. Move forward together.
Hunter Morrison is an urban planner who has worked on rebuilding Youngstown since 2002. He says the plan started with a simple premise, except that the city was smaller.
America, the entire business of planning and development is based on the phenomenon of growth. So what happens when communities see themselves shrinking?
Over the last 14 years, this new smaller mindset has been the guiding vision for the city, which took stock of its assets, like Youngstown State University with 14,000 students. The city and the university developed blighted land to connect the campus to downtown, which now has new housing and more places to go out.
Today, if you talk to a student, they go down to the restaurants. Some of them live downtown, never would have lived there before.
But beyond downtown, the city didn't have the resources to fix its broken neighborhoods. Fewer residents means less tax revenue. So in 2009, the city created a new nonprofit, the Youngstown Neighborhood Development Corporation, or YNDC, in partnership with the Raymond John Ween Foundation.
We could walk to my house if you want to keep going.
Ian Bennison is the executive director. He grew up in Youngstown. His father worked at a steel mill until it closed in 1980.
We don't go around here and talking about utopian visions. I mean, we're dealing with the real basics here. We just got to get neighborhoods cleaned up.
The YNDC has an annual budget of $3 million. The group surveyed every neighborhood in the city to figure out where it can make the biggest difference and create more stability.
Our focus as an organization is on those neighborhoods in the middle, neighborhoods that have many signs of distress, but they're not to a point where we have 70 or 80% vacancy, so that even in the future we do at least have these pockets, if nothing else, of healthy neighborhoods.
One of the first neighborhoods the YNDC targeted is called Idora, where a quarter of the houses were vacant, like this one currently being renovated by the YNDC. Tiffany Sokol has been overseeing this project.
We've been able to acquire a lot of properties at zero cost, either through bank donations or private personal donations.
Many homes the YNDC acquires are foreclosed properties and are renovated with the help of AmeriCorps volunteers.
There's an abundance of vacant homes, but unfortunately the quality is very low. So part of what we're doing here is trying to raise the standard and raise the quality of homes available.
A couple blocks away is a house the YNDC just finished.
This one was built in the 70s. So it's really out of character for the neighborhood.
It's listed for sale for $40,000, above Youngstown's median home price of $31,000, but affordable in this market.
Have you had any problems getting people to buy the homes that you've renovated?
No, most of our homes generally we end up pre-selling before we're even done with the rehabilitation.
The YNDC helps potential buyers who have low to moderate incomes through housing counseling and mortgage financing. In the past 6 years in Idora, 137 abandoned homes have been demolished, 35 homes have been renovated and sold, and 88 occupied homes have been repaired.
This was the house we fixed too. So this
Today, the occupancy rate of this stripped-down, rebuilt neighborhood is 93%.
Wait till you see it. It's pretty awesome.
Beniston showed me one more feature he's using as a selling point for Idora.
Oh, wow.
This natural waterfall right in the middle of the city.
There was literally 9 vacant houses half a block right here. So yeah, but not anymore.
Brownlee Woods is another neighborhood where the YNDC works. Nancy Martin and her husband Russell have lived here since 1982, and over the years watched people leave as their neighborhood declined.
We can do one of two things. You can either sit here on the porch and complain, or you get up and do something.
These are the benches we just put in.
She's president of her neighborhood association and meets regularly with the YNDC, which also helps residents develop their own neighborhood action plans, identifying homes that need to be demolished or fixed up.
They bring a list of all the houses that we're working on, and we go through each one.
One house that was falling apart was owned by an out-of-town businessman. Ian Beniston stepped in.
And he told them, are you going to do anything with this property? Because if you're not, we're taking it.
The community is taking over that house, and the YNDC brought more than a dozen other houses up to code in Brownlee Woods.
We are making progress. I mean, we know that in terms of owner occupancy, vacancy data. However, there's still large swaths of the city, the most distressed swaths, where people are still leaving.
In those areas of Youngstown with heavy vacancy, the focus is on simply eradicating blight with board-ups, demolitions, and cutting the grass. Robert Morris is happy to see his neighborhood getting cleaned up, but he's skeptical things will really improve.
Do you think this area will ever become what it once was?
No, I doubt it. It's over. No jobs. Nobody got jobs. Everybody's out there trying to hustle, make their buck. You know, it is what it is.
I'm gonna give myself about maybe another year or two here.
Dawn Griffin says she's had a hard time finding a job in Youngstown and thinks about leaving. Unemployment here is 8.5%, 3.5% above the national average. Griffin, a single mother of 3, remembers a better time when her father worked at the steel mills.
I thought we were rich, and we were, pretty well off, but what is here?
She also feels like the city isn't doing enough, especially in low-income neighborhoods like hers on the east side of Youngstown.
One of my questions was, okay, you're removing the blight, okay, but what's going to be there? And it's nothing but a slab of concrete there. No one wants to invest in that, you can't do it all like a little bit. You got to go all the way.
I asked Beniston about their critique.
Boarding up homes, grass cutting. I mean, how is that really going to make a big difference?
That will improve the quality of life for the people that are living there now, but by no means am I trying to say that in the most distressed of places, just cutting the grass and boarding up the houses is sufficient. I'm saying it's a reality of the lack of resources, and one of the things that we need more of here without a doubt is just jobs. I mean, that's a reality of it. That's why people leave. So until we can get to a point where we're attracting, developing, creating, even here locally, more jobs, we're going to be struggling to get to where we need to be.
Part of Youngstown's plan to create more jobs is to change its image from a city dominated by steel.
We're still primarily manufacturing focused. but there are other industries that are emerging.
Sharon Woodbury, Youngstown's Director of Economic Development and Community Planning, is trying to lure technology entrepreneurs to the city.
This is America Makes. And
She points to America Makes, a national institute for 3D printing, and also the Youngstown Business Incubator, which has created almost 400 jobs at tech startups in Youngstown since 2011.
But unemployment is still on the high side
It is.
here, right?
It was a decline over decades. It's a rebuilding that's going to take some significant time.
There are a lot of obstacles in older industrial communities.
Urban planner Hunter Morrison says progress may seem slow, but not when you understand what's happened across the region.
These communities are very much like New Orleans. New Orleans lost half its population over a weekend. Flint, Cleveland, Youngstown, Detroit lost it over a generation. It's a major trauma to a community. It takes a long time to get over it.
How do you stay hopeful? I mean, is it a false sense of hope?
I mean, for me, it's not a false sense of hope because I have a memory, and I know, for example, what this neighborhood looked like. I've also seen streets change where, dozens of houses have been removed, others have come back to life. I feel good about the progress that we've made. Am I satisfied with it? Certainly not.
Sorry. All right. Okay, everybody. So I hope you enjoyed getting to know some of the ways in which cities in the U.S. are trying to deal with these changes, these transformational changes. So what I'm going to have Lena do now is put you in breakouts. Remember, go to your breakout group and open the Google Doc, and for the next 10, 15 minutes or so, work on those 4 short answers. And then if we have time, I'll bring you all back towards the last minute or two to wrap up. Okay, so go ahead, Lena, and send them all to breakout groups.